Well, thank you very much, Russell, for the introduction and your more than usual reference to me coming from the South. Most people don't take too much notice of politics, and I've realised that most people have no idea where most politicians come from. So in Auckland, I'm able to keep it relatively low-key that I come from Dibden, and in most places I keep it relatively low-key that I used to be a Treasury official. What I thought I'd do is talk a bit about the forward view for the economy, and then some about the way that the government uses their money, because in Wellington the choices that governments make about that have quite a big impact on the many thousands of people who serve the public who live in Wellington and run our system. We have a fairly unique opportunity over the next 5 to 7 years for a period of sustained economic growth. I don't mean spectacular, I mean sustained. This government made a conscious choice back in 2008 to try and alter the New Zealand model of change, and that is go for considered and consistent change over time. So despite the fact that there were some pretty tough circumstances since 2008, we've adopted an approach of explaining what we're doing, take people along, build a pretty broad base of support for any changes that we make. And I've always thought that was the key to the success in Australia up until 6 or 8 years ago, where for 20 years they made change that their public supported, whereas New Zealand went through a lot more of a stop-start model. Now, that means that we've come through a recession and got a growing economy with a broader public support for sensible economic settings that are going to keep delivering more jobs and higher incomes. And look, those settings will get debated and are being debated occasionally through the election campaign. We want to focus on building on the resilience that all our households and businesses have shown, and on the longer term view that the government's taken about economic growth. Because you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that a number of the things that are driving the economy now will run through. The dairy prices, they've dropped a bit sooner and a bit faster than people expected. Christchurch will eventually get rebuilt, and that activity will tail off. So we're looking at what we can do now and over the next year or two that shapes growth in 2017, 18 through to 2020. And there's 2 or 3 areas which we think are going to be really important. One is the continued investment in infrastructure. Some of that's pretty obvious in Wellington. When you go up the Gold Coast, you can see the Kapiti Link Road being built, and since the advocacy started for Transmission Gully in 1919, where someone showed me the press clipping the other day, we'll actually turn aside in the next couple of months. Some of it's less obvious, like the rollout of ultra-fast broadband, but if we continue with that project, as we certainly will, we'll be, by 2019, as connected as Singapore and South Korea, which is pretty important for a country at this end of the world. Another area we'll want to focus on is just around the build-up of our skills. We've run an education and labour market system where around 20% of our young people never really get to the start line for meeting the requirements for ongoing acquisition of skills and skilled work. And 20% is around about 10 to 12,000 per year. And that is why we've had a strong focus, which needs to build up quite a way yet, on national standards in our primary schools, hitting NCA targets in our secondary schools, so that the piece of the skills pipeline that the government controls actually does what we claim it should do, and that is give every young New Zealander a reasonable chance of a productive life. And actually we've fallen too far short for a while, but we're starting to make some significant progress. Just one other, which is a bit less high profile in Wellington, but I think critical to New Zealand, is to implement the National Freshwater Framework. We spent 5 years in a collaborative process developing it, but for a country whose income is to a significant extent depends on our ability to sell more primary production-based products to the rest of the world, we need the New Zealand public to believe we can do that in a way that's not at a cost to our environment. Otherwise, they will move to slow down or close down one of the bigger engines of our economy. So it's a pretty critical strategic issue, and if we can get re-elected, we'll be able to implement legislation which is ready and waiting in order to ensure we get that balance between production and the environment right. There's any number of other longer term policies, but those are 2 or 3 which we want to concentrate on over the next 4 or 5 years to build that sustainable growth. Because people don't measure the progress of the economy by GDP. A handful of people do, and I have to talk to all of them. But GDP is not that interesting. How they measure it is their incomes and their job prospects. So if we stick to the current track, the average wage will rise from about $55,000 a year to $62,500 by 2018. So it's not spectacular. We will be one of a handful only of developed countries where real wages are actually rising. We've just seen reports in the last month from Australia, UK and the US all about real wages falling and ours are rising. So if people can see their 1 to 3% wage increase year on year, they can get somewhere, and that would be a top performing developed economy that can deliver that average wage increase. Pretty well everyone else will be doing worse. One of the things that does affect wages is how much money we take off people each week. And I often think it's important in government for us to remember why we have billions of dollars. The reason we have billions of dollars is because at the end of the week, people who are working in the office buildings here, often quite longer hours than they'd like, or they're out in the winter rolling out the broadband, hand us over their PAYE at the end of the week, $300, $400, $500. That's how we get billions. And if they kept it, they could use it pretty well on any number of pressures on their household and personal budgets, but we get it. So we need to treat it with respect. And we're, I think, getting underway with some quite significant changes in how government thinks about spending its money. And probably the best way to describe it is first they focus on results. So this has been the first Prime Minister that's allowed a government to publish measures of what it's trying to achieve. On the Beehive website, State Services website, 10 results for New Zealand, and they're pretty challenging. Crime rates, substantiated physical abuse for children, NCA pass rates, numbers of people on long-term welfare, and plus a couple of others about interaction between, how much electronic interaction there is between government and citizens and government and business. And what that's doing is creating a much stronger focus for our public service on what they're trying to achieve. Because often your money is not used well because we're not quite sure what we're trying to use it for. We just sort of feed it in. I call it dumb funding, where a politician gets up and promises a new strategy and says, I spent another 100 million, that's how I know you, that's how you know I care, because I used your money to buy your affection. Whether it worked or not, who knows? We put a much stronger focus on whether it's working. So with respect to what I said about skills, the number of Māori boys getting NCA level 2 has risen from 45% of their cohort to 57% in 3 years. You can't fix Māori education. What you can do is find out which kids in which school and what needs to be done for them, which is why our Minister of Education goes round school by school saying you need to get 28 more kids over the line. What can we do to help? You need to get 63 more over the line. What can we do to help? And one of the key ideas behind how we're changing spending, because we're spending a lot less extra per year, quite remarkably less than half what it was the first 10 years of this decade, is what we call the investment approach. So we try and work out what are the costs of failure. So it's like the opposite of a business. You need to understand your customers because they drive revenue. We need to understand them because they drive costs. And costs equal misery in government, generally, because our customers are people who commit crimes, people who have chronic illness, people who didn't get educated, people who got beaten up last Saturday by their drunken spouse. They're our customers. And some of them generate enormous costs. And we're calculating those because then it enables us to say, what would we spend now to reduce that cost in the longer term? And just give you a couple of examples. 2,000 toughest kids in New Zealand with all the worst risk factors. Some of those individually will cost you $1 million in today's dollars. We know the prison costs for that group will be $750 million, because we know the likelihood that they'll end up in prison with long, expensive sentences. So when you know that, it's a moral obligation as well as a fiscal one to do a bit more about it. And too often our systems are good at dealing with mainstream kids, for instance, but they don't deal with, well, all these really complex kids. Another example where we've actually put a lot of money in on exactly this approach, sole parents under the age of 20. If you go on and benefit under the age of 20 in New Zealand with a child, your average length of stay is 20 years. Often on several different benefits. And in today's dollars, that's $250,000. So having thought, okay, these are the most vulnerable children in New Zealand, the children of our young solo parents. So can we do more? Can we do better than saying you're 17, you're out in Tawa, you're on the DPB, sink or swim? And the answer is we can and we are. So knowing what they will cost, we're spending $7,000 a year, and each sole parent under the age of 20 in New Zealand now individually has a contracted supervising adult in their life who make sure that they're on money management, so they can only take the card to the supermarket. They make sure the rent gets paid, keep the dodgy boyfriend away because that's usually the source of danger to the child. And most importantly, get that young woman back into education, because if she gets any post-school qualification, she's off the benefit in 7 years, not 20. And that saves you millions of dollars. Now for that, because of that scheme and other reasons we don't understand, the number of sole parents in New Zealand under 20 has dropped from 4,300 to 2,600 in the last 3 years, dropped by 40%. Things aren't getting worse, they're getting better, because we're targeting investment where we can get a payoff and quantifying that. And we want to do more of that in education, because the cost of not getting a child to read by the age of 7 is very high. We've got to do it again when they're 18, and it's much harder. We may not be spending enough on the hard end, on the more challenging kids. Same with our justice system. The number of young people going through our courts has dropped 25% in 2 years, and this year we will close a youth prison. Partly the result of 5 years of very strong focus on what happens with kids who are coming through the pipeline with all the known risk factors that are going to cause high costs in the future. So that's why we got surpluses. We haven't gone on a slash and burn exercise. We've gone for smarter thinking about government spend, and it's starting to pay off. And we are a real debt to the army of public servants who have not only done more for less in the last 4 or 5 years, and maintain public services through tough times, but are rethinking how they're doing it, in some ways quite fundamentally, so that we can continue to do a better job in a world where surpluses will be small, debt needs to be repaid, and we should use money as carefully as any household does. And that's 15 minutes and 20 seconds. And I know how tough Rotary are about time, so I'll stop. Thank you.